That takes us to item number 6, 825 North College. This is an appeal of a determination of eligibility. And we'll begin with public comment. No?
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, it's not that you are incorrect. We have a procedural matter to clear up before we even get started.
Thank you.
Is the appellant, Mr. Armstrong, here? Mr. Armstrong, would you mind coming down to the podium? I need to ask you a question on the record. Mr. Armstrong, the city made a mistake in part of its procedure, and I want to be very transparent about that and give you an option of what you can do this evening. So under our city municipal code 1423, we have requirements of what we have to do before this matter is brought before the commission. The city met all of those requirements under 1423 B1 and B3. Where we made a mistake was not publishing notice of this hearing in a newspaper of regional circulation. So you have two options. You can tell us, I want to put this matter on hold and come back at the next commission meeting, and city, you need to go publish that. Or you can say, I'd like to proceed with this matter as scheduled today, and I waive any objection to the city missing that procedural item. It's completely up to you.
We'll proceed.
So you understand you're waiving any you will not be allowed to argue later that this hearing was
Correct.
Unfair because it wasn't published in
Correct.
the newspaper. Thank you.
My name is Graham Armstrong.
And I'm so sorry. I totally made this an odd procedural matter. I'm going to let the chair take it back over, and then he will tell you when it's time to talk. But I wanted to make sure we cleared that up before we even got started. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, that takes us to 825 North College and this appeal of the determination for eligibility. And we will begin with any public comment on this. Seeing none, we will move on to a staff presentation.
You're welcome to stay there, or you're welcome to have a seat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Jim Bertolini, Senior Historic Preservation Planner. This is an appeal of a staff finding determining that the property at 825 North College was eligible under the city's landmark criteria and qualified as a historic resource for development review. Just to provide a little bit of grounding and location, this is the property here fronting on the west side of College Avenue. It's on the southwest corner of Alpine and College, just north of the Poudre River and Lake Canal. This is a little bit closer of a kind of a site plan for the property, showing 3 distinct resources. One is a service station, shown here kind of on the southeast corner of the property. Along the north end is a residence, and then near the southwest corner is a garage that's considered accessory to this service station. Then shown in white is an approximation of the parcel boundary for this property. The role of the Historic Preservation Commission here, this is a de novo hearing, so you are providing a new decision regarding whether this property qualifies under the city's landmark criteria. Your role is to consider evidence regarding significance and integrity of the buildings addressed at 825 North College Avenue. The standards referenced in that are in Municipal Code 14, Article 2. And then your task is to provide a determination of eligibility, whether or not this property qualifies as an historic resource. The purpose for this is development review. There is a development proposal for this property, which required determination of whether it qualified as a historic resource or not. Your decision tonight will be subject to the right of appeal to City Council. Just a little bit about the review timeline here. There's 3 major steps. So as is common when development review, what kicked off the historic survey of this property was the receipt of a development proposal. This was a conceptual review received by the city with a review completed on August 18th. At that time, preservation staff noted that we did not have an updated historic survey for this property. And completed that survey. That survey was ordered on behalf of the developer, who is not the same as the property owner, who is the appellant this evening. The survey findings were issued to the developer and the property owner on September 7th, finding that the property was eligible, and I'll go over the standards that staff believed it was eligible under a little bit later in the presentation. And then within the 2-week period allowed for appeals, the property owner, Mr. Armstrong, appealed that finding, bringing you to tonight's hearing. And just a reminder on process, since this is initiated in the land use code, specifically 3.4.7, which covers the preservation of historic resources on development sites. But in determining eligibility, we use the same measurement as we would for a landmark nomination. Those standards for eligibility and historic integrity that are outlined in Municipal Code 14, Article 2. Based on your decision this evening, if you find that the property is eligible, then we move back into 3.4.7 and work with the development applicant on preserving any historic resources identified tonight as part of that, or potentially a modification of standards. And if you find that the property is not eligible, then that concludes the process and the development can proceed. So just as a reminder on eligibility as a historic resource, this is a 2-step process and a linear process. It starts with historic significance. Under the 4 standards they have outlined on the left side of this slide. And then historic integrity under 7 aspects that specifically relate to the reasons the property is found important. So this is just a summary of why staff considered the property eligible under 3 separate standards in Article 2. Those standards being 1 for events and trends, and this pertains to the service station and garage and their historic significance. Standard 2 for persons and groups, and that deals with both Jen and Letha Kraxberger, and pertains specifically to the residents on the property only. And then standard 3 for architecture, and that specifically relates to the service station on the front of the property. So I know there were some questions in the work session about which standards apply to which resources, and so that hopefully clarifies since there is some complexity there. And I'll go through each individual standard. So specific to events and trends, staff found the property significant as an early and long-standing business on North College Avenue, initially established about 1925 by the Kraxberger family, and then carries through to 1969. That postdates the Kraxberger period of operation, but corresponds to the general period when North College had kind of been fully built out during the mid-20th century. This pertains to the service station, which was a service station was originally built in 1925. That was later demolished. The building that's there now was first constructed in 1937, but heavily remodeled in 1960. And so the picture you see here was relates to the 1960 appearance of the building, and includes the garage as an accessory structure. And one thing that the commission would that staff suggests the commission consider here is just the evolution of the building in relation to the concept of historic integrity and how well it is or is not reflecting that commercial development story. The second standard that staff found was under persons and groups, and this specifically relates to 2 separate spouses of Mike Kraxberger. So the service station was operated by Mike Kraxberger as M&K Coal and Oil, and under various company names under the M&K moniker. At 2 separate times, he had spouses that made what staff found to be significant contributions to local history. Letha Kraxberger, or I should say Jane Kraxberger, as first wife of Mike, as a significant contributor to local art and fashion in the early 20th century. And then Letha Kraxberger, in particular, her philanthropic contribution, specifically as a local, state, and national leader in the American War Mothers Organization, which is a veterans welfare organization. This significance, staff would recommend this applies only to the residents. And the property owner did provide some additional information that he will present. And based on that, staff does have some concern that the historic integrity may not be there for this standard. And lastly, standard 3 for architecture. This specifically pertains to the service station itself. This was largely based on a 2010 historic survey that was completed by the Colorado Department of Transportation under a review process they were required to go through for the National Historic Preservation Act. That survey form determined that this service station was potentially eligible for the National Register under architecture as an early example of the oblong box type of gas stations, which in the late 50s and early 60s would have been fairly new. This became very standard for service stations across the country. This significance would pertain to the service station only. In terms of how this relates to an oblong box, what exactly is that? It is this modern style service station that has become fairly ubiquitous. Minimalist design, fairly rectangular floor plan and elevation presenting to the street. Usually has a flat roof. It's defined by having that corner office and usually 2 service bays. So this became a fairly standard footprint and design, although architectural styles might vary. This one not really having an architectural style. As is common with architectural significance, we do try to compare things within a similar context. And so we have identified a similar service station constructed in 1959, just prior to the redevelopment of the 825 North College property. So we consider the 1420 North College a good comparison property. There are other oblong box service stations along the College Avenue corridor. Most of those post-date these 2 service stations. And there was a question from the work session about what the exterior material of the current service station is. And it's a concrete block building. The front and the 2 sides has metal paneling over top, and then there's stucco on the rear. This is just a little bit of site history related to this property. Again, the first service station, which is no longer present, shown here. This was built in approximately 1925 as the first M&K coal and oil service station. In about 1931, that's when the residence that remains on the site was constructed. 1933, that accessory garage was built, just the east portion. This was expanded later in 1956. And in 1937, the first version of the existing service station was built. That's shown here in the upper right. As you can see, this was styled as a Mission Revival style building with a single service bay on the north end. In 1960, it was remodeled into what you see today, and this is a 1977 county assessor photograph showing that property, similar to its current condition. This is just showing some of the individuals that are associated with this. Mike Kraxberger in the middle. This is showing the property in the 1930s along with some of his staff. And then showing both Jane Kraxberger here with one of the advertisements for her shop, which is on West Mountain Avenue. And then an image of Letha Kraxberger shortly after she married Mike as his second spouse. I did add in an aerial photograph. So again, the photo here on the bottom right, you've already seen. This is the site photograph from a previous slide. Did provide a 1937 aerial photograph here. showing that the residence is already present. The service station, this would have been just after the new service station was constructed, and it appears that that earlier 1925 service station remained for some time. When it was demolished, we're not sure. And then also showing the eastern portion of that accessory garage. I do have some responses to work session questions here. There was a question about standard 2 evaluations pertaining to persons and groups, and whether or not there's a direct association with the house, and whether or not that's important. And based on the findings that are in the historic survey form in your packet, there is a loose connection between Jane Kraxberger's operation of kind of contributing to local culture and fashion in the early 20th century, but most of that work was conducted outside the house. The more direct connection with the house specifically is with Letha Kraxberger, who did hold some meetings from the American War Mothers in the house. Did want to clarify as well that our interpretation typically of standard 2 for city landmark designation typically allows for designation of the residence of a person who was important and did their important work elsewhere. We do frequently allow for their private residence to qualify as well, assuming it has historic integrity to the period when that important person lived there. So integrity is a critical component of that. There was a question about the 2010 CDOT finding versus the current finding. The CDOT finding was much more constrained. It considered the service station eligible under National Register Criterion C for architecture. Did not consider the garage historic based on altered integrity. And then did make mention that the that the residence was a historic property, a contributing property to the service station, although the reasons for that connection, other than a general mention of the Kraxberger family, was not well established in the survey form. And so that was one of the things that staff revisited when we issued our findings this year. Our finding was that all 3 resources were eligible under the standards that we've already covered. Again, provided some context already about the oblong box property type, which is recognized by History Colorado as a property type in our roadside architecture. And again, clarified kind of the different types of significance and which properties they relate to, at least in staff's finding. Clarified the exterior materials. And there was a question to provide some comparison on shingle style architecture. Since we typically do ask for that, and this is the residence is considered a shingle style. While significance might be there, since I'm not aware of any other shingle style residences in this part of North Fort Collins, the integrity appears significantly disrupted, and I think that'll be more clear with the appellant's presentation. So staff would not recommend this as a significant property for that reason. I do want to note for the record, we have not received any written public comments, but I did receive a verbal public comment over the phone from a Mr. John Maya, who's a resident of North Fort Collins. He's opposed to the eligible finding. He did express some general concern about development applications on the North College corridor and the timing of when these findings typically come to light with a development application or when a property sale is pending. And also concern about some inconsistency with findings related to other service stations, specifically mentioned the property at 949 East Prospect. That's the southwest corner of LeMay and Prospect. That did have an intensive survey completed and was determined not eligible. And so demolition will be allowed as part of that development application. So again, just a reminder that this is a de novo hearing. You're providing a new decision to replace the staff finding, considering the evidence as it relates to the significance of the property or any specific resources on the property, and then ensuring that they also have historic integrity to convey that significance. And then your task is to provide a new determination of eligibility for this. That concludes the staff presentation. I'll be available for questions. With that, I believe Mr. Armstrong has a presentation. I have slides from him that I will run for him while he's at the podium.
Thank you, Jim. Let's move on to the appellant presentation. Thank you. And do state your name if you would, please, and sign in.
My name is Graham Armstrong. This is my wife, Robin. Thank you. We came before this council in 2005 when the city was desperate to have anything done with North College, and way before the King Soopers was built. And we built a human being on North College at 821 North College. This property is directly adjacent to the north. This property, while now I have a little bit of pushback about whether or not it can be demolished, the city and the state had no problems pulling the tanks years ago and vacated Alpine Street. So Alpine Street is, which in one of his pictures is gravel. It's an eyesore. It's a problem for the whole neighborhood. And this development that we are proposing would pave that. That's part of the development. So we had a gentleman approach us that wants to raise all the buildings. And this is the first that we heard about that we wouldn't be able to do that. I do have a few questions. In 2010, Robert Ottoby of CDOT determined that this property was historic. What are his qualifications that allows CDOT to get involved with the City of Fort Collins preservation?
I'll note I'm not specifically familiar with Mr. Ottoby since I'm not working for CDOT anymore, but they do regularly employ historians that would have a master's or better in history or a related historic preservation field. The main reason that CDOT provided a historic survey form was because there was federal funding being utilized for the redevelopment of the North College Avenue highway. And as part of that, CDOT has responsibilities under the National Historic Preservation Act to account for their effects on any historic resources. In that case, defined as anything eligible for the National Register of Historic Places as part of their project. So that's a responsibility that applies to them. And they typically provide a historic survey form to document those findings. Those are intended to affect the decisions and project design that CDOT was creating for the highway. In our case, it was available secondary literature that we used to develop our findings that are required under the city's land use code. If that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. So this first picture shows you the residence directly north of the gas station in question. And if you look at the very front of this, let me back up and say that Jim asked me to take some pictures inside the fence because he wasn't able to get anything that was inside the fence of the property. This little tiny A-frame pitched roof addition in the front was most likely the original property. Since then, there's been 3 to 4 other additions added onto this. This is a hodgepodge mess. I mean, we just had testimony from an architect that's doing a great job on Remington. He wasn't here. This is a mess inside and it's a mess outside. So this little piece might have been the first building that everybody's referring to. Since then, it's been added onto here. And then if you flip over to 829 to the house and apartment, this is another good picture of the front, but keep going. Yeah, pass that one too, pass that one. This is an addition, again, on the back of the house, completely different siding, 1960s asbestos siding. By the way, except for that little piece, all the rest of the houses has new windows. One of the inconsistencies in the gentleman that did the report in 2010 is that he said that he is saying that the garage does not qualify because of the metal roof. And yet, back in 2010, everything that you see here had the same metal roof. The metal roof's been on there for, 20, 25 years. So the house doesn't is supposed to be considered historical with a metal roof on it, but the garage has a metal roof, and yet they say that the garage is not supposed to be considered historical. So we just need some direction. We're trying to raise this whole corner, pave Alpine, put a nice tenant in there that would be paying sales tax to the city rather than a blighted area. Go ahead and flip through the photos, Jim, and we'll let you get an idea of, keep going, of how this looks. It's we have a constant problem with homeless here, as you'll probably see in the next picture with the bike sitting around. But we're doing the best we can. But this and you can see the human being in the background. This is basically just a project that we thought we were going to move forward with to help us with our retirement, and we were going to come before you guys and propose that we do something else to beautify North College in addition to what we already did back in 2005. As far as the house and that little apartment go, there's no logic to the inside floor plan. All the windows have been resized and replaced. You'll be able to see, like there, if you go back where you just were a couple, Jim, right there, you can see that the windows have been resized and replaced. The stucco is something that wouldn't have been prior to the 1970s, I don't believe. The metal roofs. There's no clear indication on this building when it was built or what it was used for. There's some hypothesis, but there's no clear indication, and therefore I think that disqualifies that one by itself. But the 829, the other house with all of the massive, the crazy additions where it's just like a labyrinth when you walk inside it. It's not, I wouldn't call it historical integrity walking around through it, even if I wanted to, for some reason, come before the panel and compel you to make it historical. If I told you that if I came up with something, it would be a lie. The developer's willing to and has talked about potentially putting in some marble stands or some structure similar to like you see at Lake Tahoe, where there's a stand and then some photos and a photo in marble and some history about who lived there and what happened. They did propose that. That was an option that they'd be willing to do. But with what they want to do on this property, they will not be able to do it if any of these buildings stay intact. Initially, we were told that maybe just the front gas station was going to be designated historical. And then later we were told, no, also the house. Even if it was just the gas station, they spent a lot of money with their architect, redrawing everything, trying to figure out how to incorporate that initial original gas station into their development plan, and they didn't have enough room to do it. So our request is that we be allowed to move forward with our development and that we can satisfy the city by honoring these people from the 1920s and 1930s in another way on the property, designating that and touting what they've done. I mean, it talks a lot about the history of what H. Michael did over time. And we're sitting there at home looking at it going, well, we've done all this. The human being wasn't the first thing we did for Fort Collins. And yet, and I don't want my name on a plaque, but I sure don't think that my house should stand where I live just because I did all those tasks. So our request is that we're able to move forward and do this development. And I might say, it's hard for us, for somebody that's about to retire, to even be faced with this, because I'm looking at a house we own on South College, built in 1920, still has all the old antique lights and everything on the inside of it, and nobody wants that to be historical because the city's taken that whole corner from us, eminent domain, and expand in Trilby. So when it's that way, it's okay if it's not historical. That house isn't going to be historical because you guys have already, Carrie Allison's already trying to get the land from us. She will. She's working on it. So then it's okay. As long as you guys need it, no problem. But if we come to you with an idea and a proposal and a developer comes forward with something that's going to give you a tax base, then all of a sudden this crap hole that I own, it's horrible. I don't mean to, you should see the foundation. I don't mean to knock it down, but it's just, it is what it is. It was built a long time ago, and it was built in 1922, and then again in 1937, and then again in 1950 something. And nobody knows when they put the back apartment on that has asbestos shingles on. Nobody even knows when that was built. It's probably done under the radar. We don't know. Nobody knows when it became an apartment. And we have no clear indication of when the garage came into existence or what it was used for. So our proposal is based on the fact that the history isn't that clear, is that we be able to move forward and do what we want to do. And Mr. Sunday might be here. Do you have anything to say for me? Okay. Professor of history from CSU, but okay. All right. So that's all I have.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
All right, that takes us to discussion. And if you have questions for Jim or our appellant, let's begin there with any clarifying questions.
Jim, just a clarifying question relative to the CDOT determination in 2010. Was that completed by a commission or by an individual?
Yes, that would have been completed by an individual that met the federal standards for a preservation-related field. Yeah. And I might add, those findings would have been concurred with by similarly qualified professionals at the State Historic Preservation Office. That's a regular part of those federal project reviews.
Thank you, Jim. Other questions before we get started with our discussion?
I have one. You mentioned, Jim, in your presentation about questioning the integrity of the home. Is that based on the photographs that the appellant showed us tonight? Just a clearer picture of the house and its architectural progression?
Yes, that's correct. And I will also add that while aerial photography and some permit records allow us a little bit better picture of the service station itself, yes, the specific building history of the house and garage is not well documented. And so we're making inferences as best we can based on the records available.
So I have a question about the CDOT report again. So they said that the house and the service station could be nationally recognized. Is that correct? Or just the service station?
Correct. So the CDOT finding from 2010 was that the service station and residents were both potentially eligible for the National Register. I will note that the argument for significance was much clearer for the service station, but was not well supported for the residence itself.
Okay, and then another question. I was just wondering about other service stations like this that have been landmarked. So I was hoping for something added to the report today, but we didn't get that. So I just did a quick search. The ones I found are all on Route 66, which makes a lot of sense because that fits with Route 66. But I think it would be helpful if we had, I don't know if maybe staff could find something, but if there's some sense of here is an oblong box in such and such a place, hopefully not on Route 66, because we need to have a better sense of that, that was designated, especially if it was nationally, that really gives us a better sense of where the federal level of looking at these properties is, what they're thinking. I think just to have some examples like that. So I don't know if it's possible to find something like that right now, but
Mr. Chairman, Meg, there is an article published by History Colorado on the oblong box as a service station. And it gives some very good information about their evolution in terms of influence by the international style, the use of porcelain enamel panels, which this has some of that on it. So it isn't all inclusive, but it's a pretty good article, and it's fairly contemporary, talking specifically about service stations as the oblong box, and the significance as as an architectural element. So you might want to look at that one.
I couldn't tell. I did see that. I couldn't tell if the examples they showed are ones that have been landmarked. Because having Colorado say this is significant versus having the Park Service or whoever figures out the national level say it's significant. I mean, if they're saying, here's an example, it's on the register, wow, now we really get that's the federal standard of this is what this oblong box is significant for, or something. I don't know, just something that's made it past that bar is what I'm looking for.
But it would seem to me the CDOT review was for section 106. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's a fairly strict criteria, and it doesn't just involve a single individual putting forward their opinion, because it has to pass muster with others. And so I think the statement that it is eligible, that it meets the criteria of the National Historic Preservation Act, sets the bar pretty high. And so, and I agree with you. I don't know where we are with other landmark structures that might serve as some kind of indicator for us in this particular one. But my particular interest is with the oblong box service station, because I think that's the one that really stands out to me. The others are another debate, but I think the mere fact that in 2010 that met criteria, criterion C for the National Historic Preservation Act, I think says a lot about the importance of that as a building. The rest are more speculative.
I have two questions. One to follow up on Jim's comment. Jim Bertolini, why are we required to do a package deal here? Why can't we look at each of these structures individually?
To clarify, you can. You're, as part of a de novo hearing, you are providing a new finding. And if you find that some, but not all or none of the resources qualify, that's part of your potential outcome.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Armstrong, a question for you. Did you own this property? And it's probably in the material here, but did you own the property in 2010?
Yes.
And did you have an opportunity to meet with CDOT and to share your point of view at that time?
We knew nothing about this designation until in July or August when we finished with the conceptual review for the developer.
Right.
Nothing. Nobody ever told me that this was, yeah.
So a
Correct.
recommendation was made unilaterally by one person from CDOT, approved
Correct.
by other people from CDOT, and the owner of the property was not aware of that determination and never had an opportunity to comment on that finding.
Correct. That is correct, Eric.
Thank you.
I knew nothing about it. And if I could just say, Jim, the oblong box is not porcelain or enamel in this case. It's metal. In this case, just so you know.
Yeah,
you were talking about that they're all porcelain or enamel, and this one is neither.
It's just painted metal.
Correct.
Okay. The reason I bring that up is that's part of the article that I mentioned to you, Meg, and that was in the 1960s, and a very new innovation for particularly franchise service stations, and that material was developed because it resists acid and a lot of the caustic things that are used in the consequence of service stations. So whether or not this has one, it has that appearance, but I think more importantly, the overall configuration of it gives you the idea that this is very much true to its period of construction, which would have been when these sorts of facilities were franchised by major oil companies.
So I just want to clarify something Eric said. So the CDOT report was written by a preservation historian who was trained in that, who works for CDOT. He's not a transportation person, he's a historian person, but he works for CDOT. And then when it was looked over by other people, they weren't other CDOT people, they were with History Colorado, correct? Our local preservation, our state preservation office.
That's correct. Under the National Historic Preservation Act, that's the typical process, is that a qualified historian working for the agency in question, CDOT in this case, completes the survey form. Sometimes they contract that out to a third-party historian. And then it has to be concurred with, the finding has to be concurred with by the State Historic Preservation Office, which also employs qualified historians.
So it's the folks that oversee historic preservation statewide who signed off on the document.
And that's still the process that's in place today?
Specifically for what are called federal undertakings. So those are projects that are using federal funding, federal permits, or are direct actions by federal agencies. That is the process for those agencies being responsible for historic resources in their project areas. So the responsibility is not on any private owners unless they're using those federal funds or federal permits. The responsibility for project changes is on the agency doing the project or funding or permitting the project.
So there's not even a provision to notify the property owner that there's been a designation or determination made relative to that property that could have some future effect on the value or the marketability of that project?
So specifically for the National Register, I'm not familiar with what CDOT's internal policies are for notifying the public. I know they have kind of a project accountability, like all public agencies, but I can't speak to their specific policies. What I can say is that the National Register is an honorary list. Its regulatory role is imposed on federal agencies, their actions to either permit or fund projects or do projects themselves. We use that information to support our land use code, but we are not beholden to the findings of CDOT. In effect, the 2010 CDOT finding we used as kind of a secondary piece of literature to support the process we require in our city code and based on our city standards. Does that answer your question?
It does, although I find the CDOT process to be extraordinarily flawed, frankly, if at a minimum the property owner doesn't have an opportunity or isn't at a minimum informed that there's some action being taken that affects their property.
Jim,
Ideally,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead, Jenna.
So Jim, can you clarify the process a little bit? So you use the CDOT report as kind of auxiliary material, right? The staff still conducted a review of the sites and gave your own finding, right?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Jim, quick question. Can you clarify for everybody here the difference between eligible, recommended eligible, and listed?
Certainly. For the development review process, a property that's found eligible it's still offered some protection under the land use code. The responsibility of a developer is to incorporate eligible resources into their project. So it's really project driven what the outcome is. However, one of the potential outcomes for eligible resources is still demolition if the developer makes a successful request for a modification of standards. That's typically something that'll still come through this Preservation Commission to approve. That's an option that's not available for designated city landmarks. Those are protected, and while we do have a variance process for certain alterations, demolition is typically not on the list of things that can be approved for designated city landmarks. So that's really the main difference between the Development Review Code in 3.4.7 and the protections offered for designated resources is that demolition is still possible for landmark eligible resources.
Jim, one quick point of clarification. I believe you said that, I'm restating this, but I believe you said that the CDOT report is a resource, but we are not bound by it.
That's correct.
Okay. And I just want to point out for the record, for all of these projects, we don't like these kind of surprises any more than property owners do. And the best way to avoid these kind of surprises is for city council to give us a budget item that would help us to get these surveys done in advance so that property owners are notified well before they even consider selling their property to anyone else. And then everyone knows from the get-go, and all of that information would be on our website online. So developers and prospective buyers would be able to look up that information in advance and know exactly what to expect for the property they're buying. But because we don't have that funding, we have to rely on this ad hoc system where the development request is what triggers the review. And that's why there are surprises. So there is a way to stop having surprises, but it's going to take funding. And until we get enough funding and enough staff to get out there, especially with the lack of surveys we've been doing for so long, we are behind. We need to just catch up and then keep working on these new properties coming online as possibly in that historic era. And then we won't have these surprises anymore. That's the key to change this situation. So in the meantime, we're stuck with this, Jack in the Box pop up and surprise you scenario where we have to deal with things as they come up, which is unfortunate. It's no fun for anyone.
I have a potential red herring clarification question, so I apologize. But Jim Rose, you mentioned Section 106, and I am not familiar with what Section 106 is. In case that comes up later in the conversation, could we have that clarified now?
Certainly. So that's, while technically the citation's outdated since there's been a renumbering in the U.S. Code, Section 106 refers to Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and that requires federal agencies to account for their effects on historic resources for their undertakings. That's a fairly broad definition, including anything they fund, permit, or do themselves on their land or as a direct action, but it does require a fairly comprehensive cultural resource review for projects that have a federal connection of some kind. And most CDOT projects involve some degree of federal funding from the Federal Highway Administration.
And just one thing I might add. If that determination of the eligibility of those projects and being register eligible had then affected the process of the Federal Highway Administration funding any work on North College that would have affected those properties, that would have required mitigation, because those being eligible, any impact on those eligible properties would have to be mitigated. So that means they would have had to develop means by which somehow they could satisfy the letter of the law in the Historic Preservation Act to do their best to preserve the property. Now, sometimes what that would mean is it would allow the project to continue, and if, let's say, they were going to widen North College to 6 lanes, and all that property was going to be in the way. The mitigation might be Habs hair documentation and recording of all those structures simply to preserve the historic existence of those structures, but they wouldn't have been saved. As it turns out, I think there wasn't any mitigation necessary because there wasn't any effect. And so in that case, then there's no negative effect. And as a consequence, then they still remain eligible, but there isn't any requirement for CDOT to do anything more.
And then also, thank you both. Thank you to the two Jims. There was also an article that was mentioned and referenced from History Colorado. I've also looked at that, Jim. That was linked in your presentation, I think, not in our packet, but in tonight's presentation. So just so that we're all on the same page about the information that we have, would you mind pulling that up again? Maybe those of us with laptops or iPads could look at it, or I don't know how we handle this sort of information, which I think is potentially useful to our conversation, but everyone may not have had the chance to review.
Certainly, the short answer I'll give you is that staff did include what we considered relevant material from that article in the survey form that we
Got it.
issued on
Okay.
September 7th. As far as introducing the full article itself into the record, I'll have to refer to the city attorney as to whether we can do that since this is an appeal.
I love when you promote me to city attorney. So just a couple clarifying questions. The link to the article was in the staff report, which was part of the packet that was published, correct?
No, that was a later addition to the staff presentation. It's not in the published packet that's posted online.
Then I think the best thing to do, if you would like to look at that, would be to adjourn this to the next hearing time so that our applicant has time to review that and provide any rebuttal that they would like to, or they can waive that, or you all can simply not rely on it beyond what Commission Member Rose or Nelson or our staff have told you about so far.
I will not agree to waive that. It wasn't in the packet. I haven't seen it either. It should be excluded.
So the portions of it that were in the packet and referenced in the staff report, just to be clear, are fair for you to rely upon. The remainder, I would ask that you not consider in your decision-making process.
Thank you for the clarification. All right, let's get on then to the three issues that we need to chat about and make determination of significance and integrity. The first for the station only is for events and trends, and I'd like to hear some discussions around that. Does this fit events and trends for 3.4.7? And I would remind everyone that 3.4.7 covers design, materials, workmanship, location, setting, feeling, and association.
Mr. Chairman, can you clarify, are we going to address those issues for each individual structure, or are we
So
looking
this
at the
one,
three in aggregate?
This one, as Jim talked about, was for the station only, for events and trends. The persons and groups, number 2, is for the residents only, and then number 3, the architecture, is for the station only, is the way I understand it. Is that correct?
I think events was the service station and the garage.
And the garage. Thank you. Okay. I'm in that.
I think I struggle more with the significance of the garage towards events. I think the service station makes a lot more sense. It has a name, the style has a name, whereas the storage used to be a house maybe thing in the back doesn't. It's kind of a vernacular hodgepodge storage building style. I just don't know that it fits the level of significance for events.
I agree.
And I suppose in terms of events, the event is our community moving across the river, which is kind of a big deal because across the river is kind of like across the tracks in some sense, and yet here's a business moving that way. So that's significant, and I totally get that the service station fits into that because that's the actual center of commerce that we're talking about. Storage in the back doesn't seem to fit into that. I don't know. It just doesn't seem to rise to a level of significance to me in terms of moving north or change in automobile use or any of that. It's storage. Or, unless it was a garage where they worked on cars, but it doesn't. It's got the 3 bays, but it still doesn't seem as significant as the service center to me.
I would agree with that. I mean, looking at when if we look at like the historical trajectory of the 1920s into the 1950s with the rise of the automobile and the growth of the city and that sort of thing, is, you know, by the time that we get to the 1950s, we're a whopping 14,000 residents and all that, you know. I think that's much more significant than the storage shed.
Well, it's bigger than a shed, but
So let's keep that in mind and keep moving it forward.
Mr. Chair, I'd kind of
yeah.
like to hear what other folks think on that. Only a couple of us spoke up.
I was nodding my head, which doesn't get recorded in the minutes, so I apologize. I'm not sure that I have much to add. I was sort of frantically flipping through the packet one more time to make sure that, Meg, I mean, you came up with sort of a guess about, I mean, it might have been used for this, the garage, that is. But I don't think we've seen evidence that shows that that's the case. And in that case, it doesn't seem like that building, meaning the garage / what we're calling the storage shed, is significant for events or trends.
I agree.
Other commissioners' thoughts?
Well, I'm not so sure that I agree with the events and trends, even on the gas station, to be honest with you. But definitely the garage, I think, is just, it's not something that, and the CDOT report didn't include it in the beginning, so I think that was an easy one to set aside. I'm more concerned about the garage and the service station and the house. So I'll hold my comments until we get to those.
Thank you. Let's move on to number 2.
Walter has something to say.
It's not very important. I was just going to agree with what Margot was saying. In my mind, the garage I've kind of just put aside as like not significant in this kind of discussion. So I would go with the service station and the events and trends as being more important.
Thank you.
So, sorry to keep this going. Margot, you mentioned that you don't think that the service station is significant for events and trends. Are we coming back to that? We are.
Yes.
Okay, I apologize for not following the
No worries.
laid out agenda.
My students can't follow me either.
Oh, I won't comment on that. It only as a reflection of my abilities, not of yours.
All right, I'd like to get everything on the table, and then we'll make some final decisions. For persons and groups, that's the residents only, as I understand it, and that refers to the 3 people of significance in the residence. Let's chat about that, and then we'll circle back around to the architecture of the station, and then look at this whole issue as a whole.
Mr. Chairman, I know we have some latitude when it comes to whether or not events took place on site or in the specific home. However, I discount that a little bit in this situation. I don't feel that the events and trends were sufficiently established to warrant historic designation. And part of that is due not only to the fact that the events didn't occur on site, but that they don't necessarily represent the history of Fort Collins, in my estimation. There may be important aspects in fashion history or World War II history in a different context, but I don't think that they represent, with these 2 women, what they accomplished, don't represent the history of Fort Collins.
Thank you.
I would also say that the house, the way it exists now, or shall we say a conglomeration of structures, I doubt if it has any resemblance to what the house looked like when the event actually took place. It seems to me like the historical significance has been totally blown on that structure.
Thank you.
Well, I want to start with the architecture of the house, even though we're not looking at that as significance, but I'm I'm deeply concerned by the number of shingle houses we're losing in Fort Collins. We didn't have many to begin with, and we're losing them quickly. However, I don't think that this house has a level of significance for that even to be considered, and it wasn't even recommended. So I just wanted to make that statement that if this house is demolished, it's yet one more shingle house we're losing, which I just find a little sad. And it's a loss of our history. As far as for people, I have no problem with events happening elsewhere because, especially when a woman goes home, she does a lot of her work there anyway. But I don't see that they're in, and I believe what they did is a very important part of Fort Collins history in terms of women's history overall. I think all women's contributions are an important part of our local history. I just don't know that these two women in particular did anything. I don't know. I'm not convinced. I don't feel like we've had a solid enough argument presented to us that what these two women did was, I don't know, in any way really pivotal or substantial enough to landmark this house. And there are some women's history stories for Fort Collins, even in terms of fashion and design I think of Liz Case when I just think of in terms of getting involved in social issues and community issues. And wow, that's a perfect example right there of a person whose life made a really significant difference in our community. And, you know, if she did all her work sitting on her back doghouse, I'd say let's landmark that doghouse because I know right away was a really, really critical, important part of our history. I'm not convinced of that for these two women. Not to say that I think it's great that we had local merchants that were women, and we had many of them, and this is some great examples of that, and that were really involved. I just don't know that they rise above the level of the average shop owner, I guess is what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Sorry about the rambles.
No, thank you for putting into words what I've been feeling in my gut, to be honest. I'm not sure that I could put it more clearly than you, but I also haven't seen evidence, to be honest, that these two individuals are so important in our local history that we should save the house that they lived in. And I also share the trepidation about the integrity of the home. I'm not sure that it's intact enough to make it worth the effort.
It just seems to me that if we're really just talking about significance, I think I can give you a pass on that in terms of the importance of these individuals and whether or not their association is vital, but I think it's going to fail miserably in terms of integrity. And so, you know, it has to meet both of those. And in order to satisfy the significance aspect, you know, we can debate that and determine the relative importance of the individuals. I think the integrity aspect that we'll discuss subsequently, I think, is the place where I have the most concern.
All right, yeah, let's move on to that. I think we've talked a bit about the integrity of the residents. Is there any more discussion around that? Really, what we're focusing on for this one is the impact of the two women. And I would agree. I like the word, Meg, that you use, pivotal. I don't, you know, they did important things, but were they pivotal to the history of Fort Collins? And I don't know that it rises to that standard.
Mr. Chair, another consideration is that I suspect if that building stood the way it is now, no one driving by is going to know anything about either of the Mrs. Cracksburgers, but the suggestion of putting up some kind of a plaque or to describe the importance that they held or the significance that they held, say that there was some significance, I think that's there's going to be a whole heck of a lot more people in Fort Collins who are going to know who those two ladies were from that than just driving by a dilapidated, cobbled together structure.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I would say of the sort of 7 aspects that we would look at, the only one that I can say really maybe is there may be a couple location and setting. But I think to determine the design and how that might have originally appeared versus what Mr. Armstrong showed us in terms of this obvious hodgepodge of ad hoc additions, I think it really calls into question the change of materials, the workmanship, and the overall feeling. I don't think the feeling is the same now as it would have been when it was originally constructed as a residence. So I think there's any number of these aspects that kind of fall short. And so that's where I just don't think it meets the integrity component.
Thank you. Let's move on and put the architecture of the station on the table, and then we can begin making narrowing some decisions and call for a motion. This is for architecture, and again, we're looking at significance and integrity of the station under the architecture, specifically the oblong.
Mr. Chair, I have a comment. I think that if we were, let me move this closer. I think if we were looking at the original 1937 structure, I'd have maybe a different thought and feeling about this. Because to me, that's a fairly unique style. And what they did in the 60s was what happened so much in the 60s with urban renewal, where things that I would consider had historic character were torn down or severely modified and redone into something that was, I guess, popular at the time. But the revision to the Amico station, in order to get there, they had to severely modify and change the original building. So even if we consider the oblong box structure as a significant architectural style, I don't think this fits that because of the modifications. I think the building was so revised and revamped in order to fit into that mold that it is not an original example of that style of architecture.
Thank you.
I would have to say I completely disagree with that. If we look at the Northern Hotel, it's landmarked because of its Art Deco features, which is a substantial modification from the Victorian 4-story it was before that, which was a modification from the Victorian 3-story it was before that, which was a substantial modification of the 2-story. Actually, first it was a little triangle. It was the big triangle. Before that, it was a little triangle. Before that, it was just a rectangular brick box. Before that, it was a wooden hotel. Before that, it was in a totally different location, and yet it's landmarked and it's a beloved site. And so the building changing over time means we're not going to landmark it for what it was in the beginning, but we would landmark it for what it ended up in the end. And that's what we're looking at here. It's an oblong box now, and it was historically turned into that. So that's what we would be looking at. We're not looking at what it was before that, although I think this would be a less difficult discussion if it was that earlier version, because it was cute, and an oblong box is an oblong box. So I can't say it's the most beautiful form of architecture, but boy, does it typify our thinking in terms of architecture at that time, and we are still in that era. Just look at all the new boxes going up everywhere. So in that sense, I would say this fits to a T what the oblong box is. It's got the little office in the corner. It's got the little garage doors on the opposite side. I mean, it's classic. If you dropped me in the middle of nowhere and you stuck that in front of me, I would immediately know it was a service station. It is that clear to me what it is based on its architecture. That's the era when it's telling you, this is for a car. Bring your car by. I mean, it screams that to me. And so I think in terms of architecture, it fits. It is exactly what the description of this type of architecture is. The question for me is, how does Fort Collins view that in terms of significance? I personally am not thrilled with oblong boxes. They're not pretty. They're not Victorian little, gingerbreaded buildings. And yet it still tells our story of who we are as a people. And the fact that we were willing to tear down really those beautiful, pretty gingerbready buildings in order to build these, that says something about us as a people. So in terms of that, I think that's where the significance would lie.
Thank you, Meg.
Mr. Chairman, I absolutely agree with what Margot said. And I visited this site today and looked at all three structures and came back and looked at the photographs of the original 1925, I believe, and 1937 building. The 1937 building is essentially the gas station that my grandfather owned in eastern Nebraska and that my mother grew up working in. So yeah, there's a nostalgic feeling for those structures. However, when I see the current iteration, in the photographs and as I visited it today, I just don't see an architectural statement that resonates. The oblong may be important. It reminds me a bit, frankly, in this case, of a visit that I took to Bratislava shortly after the wall came down and the Soviet Union dissolved, and it's just very functional architecture. Not to suggest that there's not room for function in architecture, but I think these buildings in certain cases, and probably in this case, were designed to be inexpensive, to put up quickly, and to be purely functional without any real resonating or enduring design that suggests that they should be protected at the same level as some other buildings. I recognize that statement will create a lot of controversy among the people sitting at this table, but I don't see that it has the architectural significance to retain it. And in looking in aggregate at those three buildings on the site, listening to the current owner's point of view, I have to agree. It's a blighted site. It's deteriorated. It hasn't been well maintained. And in addition to looking at the past, I feel compelled to look to the future. So what's the future of this site in the next 25 or 50 or 75 years? I don't feel that it will be improved. I feel that it'll probably stay the same. There won't be another buyer who comes in and wants to purchase it. We know the current owner's point of view on it. So what legacy do we leave for future generations with respect to this whole three-structure property if we vote not to move forward with the proposal?
Thank you.
Or with the owner's proposal?
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I would, and I concur with Meg, although I guess I would add, I don't think there's any particular need to concern ourselves with anything that happened before 1950. I mean, the other stations that were on this site are of no relevance because this structure, this station is relevant and eligible because it was constructed in 1950. And it is constructed and was altered in the 1960s, and it fits exactly, prototypically, the style of that era. And that's exactly what we're trying to demonstrate. That's the story we're trying to tell. That's why it's important to Fort Collins, because Fort Collins was part of that movement. It was all across the country. I mean, Standard Oil franchised hundreds of these stations, and they all look just like this. So I think it's important for Collins' component of that story to be told, and this building tells that story. Doesn't matter what was there before. It's simply this began, and it is eligible because it's 72 years old.
Thank you.
just want to point out that the Linden Hotel was so dilapidated that it had 6 inches deep of pigeon poop on the second and third story, and the back wall fell out when they started rehabilitating it, and yet they continued to rehabilitate it, and just a portion of the second story recently sold for over $2 million. So the fact that something is dilapidated now doesn't mean we have any sense of what's going to happen to it in the future.
Meg, I agree with that, and I appreciate the historic significance of all of these properties. But for every example you give like that, and I don't have a specific one, we can look around the community and find another half dozen examples of places that haven't been renovated and haven't been maintained. So that's a great example of one that has, but I bet if we got in the car and took a drive just around North College, we could find, like I said, for every one example of something that has been cared for and renovated, a half dozen that haven't been, and probably won't be, sadly.
I'm just saying that that's not a reason that we use for designating or not designating, and that even important buildings, if a building is important, even if it's dilapidated, we have in the past landmarked them, and it's just that the dilapidation is not a reason not to landmark something. That's not one of our criteria we use. If the dilapidation has somehow affected the integrity, then that would be part of the issue. But just something falling apart and not being maintained, well, perhaps if it's landmarked, then they'll start taking advantage of the tax credits and the other incentives that help rehabilitate. But the dilapidation itself is just not part of our criteria.
I appreciate the conversation, and as I've been looking at all of this, I come down on the side of story, and I'm kind of with Megan and Jim with this, that this does tell a story, and it's a very prototypical example of the story of these gas stations and of the development of Fort Collins and the larger United States in the 1960s and that sort of thing. And so I come down leaning toward eligibility for the gas station. The garage, the house, I'm okay with not doing that with, but the station, I'm leaning toward looking at eligibility. That's where I am.
I think part of what we need to be thinking about as a community, not just the commission, is what is our story and when does the story end? And I think when it comes to historic preservation, we often think that that story ended around right before World War II. And the rest of the story, well, that's just when I grew up. That's not really part of our story. You know, it's so close to us, we don't think about the value of preserving that history. And yet for our kids, our growing up is ancient history, and that's the history that we kind of want them to understand and know, so that when they're looking back on the overall history of Fort Collins, they understand it better and they have the artifacts to get it. And cars and the change that made to Fort Collins is incredibly significant. And it really is part of the story that, especially as we become a more bike-friendly, pedestrian-friendly city, that car time period is an important part of our history. And as we are redoing our streets and improving, basically kind of going back to the way people used to build, where you could walk places and bike places, we want to remember that there was that time period where we went car crazy and we shot south mostly. And the fact that we shot north is kind of particularly interesting because most of our growth has been to the south. And yet it was, I mean, if you drive up North College, it's almost all car businesses. So there's something to that. There's something to that story. There's something about who we have been as a people in terms of using our cars. The very fact that teenagers for fun would get in their car and drive for hours on a Friday night, that's a story my kids would not understand. They can't even imagine growing up that way. That's the kind of story we need to make sure somehow we're saving tangible artifacts so that someday they look back and go, really, you did that? Do you have proof? Yeah, well, that's the A&W we stopped at. There's the center parking we would park at. And I mean, those are the things we need to help tell that story. And for us, it's not that important of a story. It's just kind of the how things have been. But for our kids, that's an important part of their history.
Thoughts from other commissioners? At this point, I would maybe recommend, if there's no more discussion, and I would love to hear more discussion, that perhaps we put a motion on the table. I'd like to take a short recess at 8 o'clock, maybe just a 10-minute recess to stretch our legs a little bit. But maybe we could get a motion on the table. There'll be no discussion during the recess. But just to move this forward. If there's more, and then once we have the motion on the table, then there'll be discussion around the motion. But certainly, just a reminder, we don't need to have a unanimous decision.
Mr. Chair, if I might make a suggestion, because I feel like
Thank
this
you.
is going to be a little bit tricky with the motions. If someone would like to make a motion, and I'm not suggesting that they do or they don't, but if someone would like to put a motion on the table regarding the eligibility of the home and the garage as one unit, and perhaps separate out the station, because that is what I'm sensing will have more of a discussion on the motion, that might be a most efficient way to handle this matter.
Thank you.
So, point of clarification. So that would be two separate motions, or everything contained in one motion?
I think the easiest way to do it would be two separate motions.
Thanks.
Because it seems we have some level of consensus around the house and the garage. So let's perhaps make a motion there and then recess and then dig into the station some more. So I would entertain a motion for, well, any motion, but perhaps taking the advice of counsel.
I'm willing to give it a stab, but I might need a little help near the end with the findings of fact. I move that the Historic Preservation Commission find the residential house and the accessory garage located at 825 North College Avenue do not meet the eligibility standards outlined in Section 14-22 of the Fort Collins Municipal Code and are not historic resources for the purpose of project review under Land Use Code 3.4.7 based on the following findings of fact. That they lack the level of significance and integrity that we would expect to see.
I think that's sufficient, Meg.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Meg.
Second.
And a second from Jim Rose. So this is a motion to say that the residence and the accessory garage at 825 North College do not meet the standards of significance and integrity in 14.22 and 3.4.7. This was put forward by Meg and seconded by Jim Rose. Is there discussion on this motion? Hearing none, let's call for a roll call vote on this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eric Gunther,
Yes.
Ann Nelson,
Yes.
Walter Dunn,
Yes.
Jenna Edwards,
Yes.
Meg Dunn,
Yes.
Jim Rose,
Yes.
Bonnie Gibson,
Yes.
Margot Carlock,
Yes.
Kirk Knierim.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, the ayes have it. Motion carries.
Thank you. At this point, it is nearing 8 o'clock, and I would call for a 10-minute recess, and then we will come back and finish discussion agenda item number 6. It is now 8 o'clock. Let's adjourn back here at 8:10 p.m.
Mr. Chair, you have all 9 present.
Thank you. All right, let's resume our discussion around the gas station. And we are talking about its significance and integrity around events and trends and architecture. And I'd like to hear more comment about that, and then we'll consider a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I guess from the aspect of events and trends, and I think Meg mentioned this earlier, I think there's a commercial aspect to this kind of a facility that weaves itself into the history by virtue of the development and evolution of commerce in Fort Collins and the whole kind of progress that was made in terms of improvement of highways and transportation and all of those elements that I think this is a part and piece of that. And I think it's a part that's particular to Fort Collins because, as has been documented in the background material, it's the first station really north of the river. And I think that says something about how Fort Collins was evolving in the era of transportation and growth. And so as a consequence, I think from an integrity standpoint, we can talk about all kinds of other things. But from a significance standpoint, I think it does meet the criteria that suggests it has to have contributed in some way to our understanding of how things were developing in that history we're talking about. I would also agree. I don't think it's the most significant component in terms of making it eligible. I think by far the architecture has to me unquestionably a very significant aspect. But I think because of its association with the growth and development of Fort Collins, I think it meets that criteria. So I would suggest that it is eligible from that standpoint.
Thank you.
I clearly struggle with this one. I think probably nobody at the table has a better appreciation for how the automobile revolutionized American transportation than me, having worked for Ford Motor Company and the Ford family for 31 years. I'm actually just looking back at some old Henry Ford advertising from the 20s when they talked about making places that were previously inaccessible to people now accessible, whether that's the mountains and the valleys or north of the river here in Fort Collins. I liken it to some of my experience with helping Ford develop dealerships over time. And we traditionally, in that capacity, and again, we all speak from experience, tried to find enhancements or improvements for facilities. And so a little bit of my point of view is informed by that experience. I just really struggle with this particular oblong box being a very important architectural style. I'm not an architect, but to me, as I mentioned earlier, it seems like a lot of these buildings were developed with a dispensable mindset. The builders, the owners wanted to put them up cheaply so that they could get the fastest possible return on their investment. They didn't put the buildings up with any concern for the architecture or the beauty. They wanted to make them functional so they could make money. And that's the sad reality of it. So when I look at a very functional space like this, I tend to see just that, something that doesn't really make a statement. It's very nondescript. I have a hard time seeing how it really tells a story or connects South Fort Collins to North Fort Collins or really defines the history of our community. To me, it's a very generic structure.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I think addressing the events and trends part, I am absolutely in agreement that the introduction of the automobile and the mobility that it gave to citizens and people to be able to travel, the importance that it played in the development of society, I think all of that is very legitimate. To me, if we were looking at the original structures, that was more around the time when that trend happened. I think by the 60s, that was a well-established pattern of life, and I don't see that as as significant as an event and trend at that point, particularly considering what it might become now, or if we do uphold eligibility, it'll just end up staying the same, staying there. There won't be an ability to redevelop that area. I just don't see it as meeting the significance required to obviate the interests of the owner.
Thank you. Council.
Mr. Chair, if I might, I think all the comments are well taken. I just want to remind the commission that in this forum, the policy regarding what happens with the future development is not relevant to your consideration. So when you are deciding, when you are articulating reasons for that decision, I would just caution against having that as part of your rationale.
Thank you.
My apologies.
Can I ask just a question about that? And I probably should know this, but is that stated somewhere, Claire? Because I have a hard time really separating decisions that we make. Generally, a decision that we make, you have to consider implications for the future, as difficult as that may be. But is that stated somewhere?
So what I would say is that what is stated is the code provisions that you are allowed to rely upon and use as the criteria for your decision. That the legislative body of City Council did not see fit to put future considerations of development within the purview of the Historic Preservation Society is certainly something that this commission could address with council, but at this time is not within the purview. And so what we see is that this commission has, its strict purview is historic preservation, but when or if this were to go and be appealed before City Council has the ability to take into account other policy considerations because that is within their purview. I completely understand the frustration. I think council themselves have been recently expressed some frustration that this commission is so limited in what they consider. But as the code stands now, that is the parameters of your consideration.
Mr. Chairman, can I make a comment?
Certainly.
I understand the city attorney's position, but I want to bring up to the council that none of this would have happened if we hadn't have made a development request. And so while the historical preservation wants to keep everything separate, we get blindsided by it when we submit. We pay money for a conceptual review. We lay out a lot of work to other people that are drawing everything up, and then we find it. And so why I understand what she's saying, but it doesn't make any sense at all, because by us not developing this, we wouldn't be here tonight. And this also includes a vacant, blighted lot behind the property with a bunch of foundations that was in the aerial photos earlier. So future development does matter, because that's why you brought me here today.
So,
Because I asked for future development.
And Mr. Armstrong, you are pointing out exactly the frustration with the code that I believe Chair Member Dunn had pointed out. What I would suggest, sir, is that you make public comment at city council meetings, because that is how city council will precipitate the change to the code.
Thank you. That being said, is there other discussion around this, or would someone like to push forward a motion on the station only, and then we can have more discussion around that before a vote?
I can make an attempt.
Thank you.
I move that the Historic Preservation Commission find the service station at 825 North College Avenue meets the eligibility standards outlined in Section 14-22 of the Fort Collins Municipal Code and is an historic resource for the purposes of project review under Land Use Code 3.4.7, based on the fact that it embodies an important evolution in commerce and transportation in Fort Collins as businesses began to move north of the Poudre River, in part enabled by the growing use of motorized transportation, and on the fact that the architecture is a classic example of the utterly unornate oblong box style of garage architecture.
Commission Member Dunn, may I make a clarification? The second point you made, was that a point that speaks to the integrity? The first points surely spoke to the significance, but I just want to make sure we also have a factual basis for integrity.
So my first point spoke to events. The second spoke to architecture. I didn't even include integrity. So, and finding that it had integrity to support both aspects of significance.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I second it.
Thank you. All right. The motion has been put forward by Commissioner Dunn, seconded by Commissioner Rose, that the service station at 825 North Fort Collins meets the standards for eligibility under 3.4.7 for significance and integrity. Is there discussion on the motion?
I just want to point out that I added the utterly unornate on purpose because as we move to post-World War II architecture, we will more often start to see forms of architecture such as brutalist that people don't necessarily take to. We don't want to run up and hug it. It's not pretty. It's not quaint. It's not something we're drawn to. It's really, I mean, that's part of the international style is boxes and glass and things that we're very used to now, but we don't necessarily feel like we get attached to, and yet it still tells our story. And that's what historic preservation is about, is not saving the pretty things, but saving the important things that tell our story.
Thank you. Other discussion on the motion? Hearing none, let's have a roll call vote on the motion on the table regarding the service station at 825 North College Avenue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eric Gunther,
Nay.
Ann Nelson,
Yes.
Walter Dunn,
Yes.
Jenna Edwards,
No.
Meg Dunn,
Yes.
Jim Rose,
Yes.
Bonnie Gibson,
Yes.
Margot Carlock,
No.
Kurt Knierim.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, 6 yes, 3 no, motion passes.
Thank you.